Good evening, everyone. I will step back slightly. I realise my head is being slightly cut off on the Zoom. I am Professor Ian Gadd. I'm chair of the board of directors here at the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution, and I'd like to welcome you all, those of you here in the room and those of you online, to our annual Victor Suchar Christmas lecture. And I want to particularly single out Jan Watterson, who, right at the back, yes, who won our Christmas Carol competition, and with it, not only tickets to tonight's lecture, and I'm glad you're here, but also courtesy of the Little Theatre Cinema, got to see the Muppets Christmas Carol on Monday. As many of you will know, we hold dozens of public talks every year here at Queen Square on a wide range of subject areas. And we pride ourselves on the quality of our speakers and the talks that they give. And this is particularly true for our Christmas lecture, which is always the acme and apogee of our annual programme. Our Christmas lectures were begun by Victor Suchar back in 1998, and following his death in 2007, they were renamed in his honour. And their purpose has been to invite the very best of speakers from across the academic disciplines to explore a key topic, a key question, a key issue. And speakers have included, deep breath, the mathematical physicist Sir Michael Berry, the philosopher John Gray, the geneticist Steve Jones, the Shakespearean Jonathan Bates, the polymer scientist Julia Higgins, the biographer Hermione Lee, the royal astronomer Lord Martin Rees, and just last year, Dr. Tristram Hunt, director of the V&A. And it is an illustrious and distinguished list, and I'm particularly grateful to our BRLSI colleague, Professor Stuart Reynolds, who leads on the selection of our Christmas speakers. And sadly, he's not able to join us tonight, but I know that he is watching online. And so it is an honour and a privilege to welcome this evening's speaker to Queen Square. Professor Dinah Birch, CBE, is Emeritus Professor of English Literature at the University of Liverpool, and as Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Cultural Engagement at that university, she was responsible for the university's wide-ranging programme of cultural activities. And earlier today, she said it was one of the best jobs she's ever had in terms of the kinds of people that she got to meet and work with. Professor Birch has published widely on Victorian fiction and poetry, and on the work of the artist and critic John Ruskin. And her books include, and this is simply a sample, Ruskin's Myths, and Our Victorian Education. She's also the general editor of the Oxford Companion to English Literature, which, along with every English lecturer and professor in the country, I have a copy of that on my bookshelves. She has published editions of Elizabeth Gaskell's Cranford, Anthony Trollope's Can You Forgive Her, and The Small House at Allington with Oxford University Press, together with recent essays on George Eliot, Anthony Trollope, and John Ruskin. And early next year, hopefully, Oxford University Press will be publishing her very short introduction to Anthony Trollope, which feels like possibly the most challenging topic to have a very short introduction about. She writes regularly for the Times Literary Supplement, and in fact, an abridged version of this lecture will appear in the Christmas issue of the Times Literary Supplement. She contributes to Melvin's Bragg in Our Time and Sky Arts documentary broadcasts, and has served as a judge on the Booker Prize panel. And her topic could not be more seasonal: Dickens and the Victorian Christmas book. Dinah, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, Ian. And let me begin by saying that it is a real pleasure to be with you tonight. So, an important question. Can you all hear me right at the back? Good, I'm glad to hear it. And if that ceases to be the case, you must let me know. I'm going to talk to you this evening about a remarkable literary tradition, the tradition of the Christmas book as it flourished in the mid-Victorian period. And in doing so, I will have much to say about Dickens's A Christmas Carol, published in 1843. It's gone to sleep. Don't worry. A minor glitch. Yep. There we are. Now, this has become A Christmas Carol, much the best known and most influential representative of its type, and it kick-started the Victorian vogue for such books. I want to explore the circumstances of the composition of A Christmas Carol alongside the reasons for its popularity and its surprisingly enduring presence in our modern understanding of the meaning of Christmas. But I also want to say something about the wider phenomenon of the Christmas book within Victorian Britain. And it's worth remembering that A Christmas Carol wasn't Dickens's only contribution to its development. He wrote 5 Christmas books in all, and they were among his most widely read works. He was an enduring influence on the form, but he wasn't alone. Partly, but not entirely, because of the resounding success of A Christmas Carol, many other writers began to produce Christmas books, using the model to further their own interests and priorities as writers. The ideals that shaped the Victorian reverence for Christmas still linger in the collective mind, sometimes hardly recognized, and the Christmas book has had a great deal to do with their persistence. So I will begin with A Christmas Carol. How did it come to be written? Dickens had the idea for the book at a difficult moment in his life, his personal life and his professional life. He was still a young man. He was 31 years old, but he had already achieved astonishing success. He'd published 5 substantial and very popular novels: Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, Old Curiosity Shop, Barnaby Rudge. He'd also made his mark as a prolific journalist and a literary editor. He had a very busy social life, an active public presence. He was mixing with influential writers and social reformers, and he had established a rapidly growing family with his wife, Catherine. He had 4 children. There was a 5th on its way. But he was tired, unsurprisingly. And his 6th novel, Martin Chuzzlewit, which began its publication in serial parts in 1842, was not going down well with readers and critics. Sales figures for that novel were poor, and sales figures mattered to Dickens because he was worried about money. He spent as fast as he earned, sometimes faster. And there were debts. He didn't feel financially secure, and he was worried about himself. Was all this pressure, and there was huge pressure, was all this pressure making him cynical, hard, so many mouths to feed, so many people depending on him? Was he losing his humanity, becoming consumed by the ever more competitive and commercial business of fiction, the business that had brought him fame and prosperity, but perhaps at a high cost? The urgency with which A Christmas Carol was written in just 6 weeks at white heat. That urgency signals Dickens' feeling that he needed a change of direction in his life as a writer, a project that would renew his sense of purpose and refresh his creative energy. And he came up with something very special. I'm sure you're all familiar with the basic story. Who isn't? But I will just summarize it very quickly. Ebenezer Scrooge, brilliantly chosen name. A cold-hearted miser is visited on Christmas Eve by the ghost of his former business partner, Jacob Marley. That illustration, like the other illustrations in the book, is by John Leach. It's a hand-coloured tinted version. So Marley warns Scrooge of a dismal fate in the afterlife if he does not mend his ways, and tells him that he is to be given a second chance, a last chance to reform. Scrooge is then visited by three ghosts, the ghosts of Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas yet to come. His eyes are opened, and he comes to recognize the misery of the poor who live alongside him in London and the struggles of his underpaid and overworked clerk, Bob Cratchit, as Bob tries to provide for his large family and care for his disabled son, Tiny Tim. So Scrooge wakes from his haunted night slumber on Christmas Day as a changed man, as generous as he had previously been tight-fisted, and he saves Tiny Tim from the early death that would otherwise have been the boy's destiny. So it's a relatively simple narrative framework, and the book is not long, but its strategies are complex. Scrooge, before his conversion, is by no means a straightforward villain. There's a pathos about his pinched and solitary existence, which evokes the sympathy of readers alongside their condemnation. And Scrooge's response to the terrifying visitation of the dead Jacob Marley is not without courage, and it displays touches of the humour that Dickens's readers had come to expect from his work. Marley's ghost, a brief example, Marley's ghost speaks in his sepulchral tones. I'm not going to try for sepulchral tones. I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring, Ebenezer. You were always a good friend to me, said Scrooge. Thank ye. You will be haunted, resumed the ghost, by 3 spirits. Scrooge's countenance fell, almost as low as the ghosts had done. Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? He demanded in a faltering voice. It is. I think I'd rather not, said Scrooge. Without their visits, said the ghosts, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. Couldn't I take 'em all at once and have it over, Jacob? There is and you'll hear this, there is a doubleness here and a kind of unexpected lightness of tone. Marley's haunting has a solemn purpose, but Scrooge's quasi-comic response means that the narrative voice flickers between different registers with an instability that is characteristic of the book. Despite Scrooge's callous rejection of the claims of charity at the beginning of the book, Dickens makes sure that the reader is always partly on his side, as we're always partly on the side of those who make us laugh. John Leech's illustrations pick up this varying tone, moving as they do between comedy, pathos, anger, and drama. And here you see two pictures side by side. That's Christmas present, surrounded by plenty, that genial figure. And also, again, Christmas present with those two terrifying figures of the children, ignorance and want, part of the social message of A Christmas Carol. There is, in fact, something of Dickens's own Quicksilver temperament in Scrooge, and his mean-spirited behaviour in part reflects what Dickens feared he might become if he allowed himself to be overwhelmed by his preoccupation with money. There's a letter he wrote at the time he was composing Christmas Carol, thinking gloomily about the fifth child that was about to add to his family, and fantasizing of this baby on a toasting fork, which is not exactly, is it, a warm-hearted family sentiment? And I think, and here I speculate, and perhaps I'm not being fair, I do think there is a little bit of Scrooge in most of us. Not perhaps everyone, but most people. Once beyond childhood, few of us do not feel, with the inexorable approach of Christmas, the occasional echo of Scrooge's "bah, humbug" response, the presence, the fuss, the demands of good humour, charitable benevolence. And why can't people just make more effort not to be poor? Are there no prisons? Are there no food banks? And those momentary flashes of identification with Scrooge, however brief, are an important reason, I would argue, for the force of the book. We don't just witness Scrooge's conversion. We're caught up in the process. We are converted along with Scrooge. As many critics have noted, one of the reasons for the book's pioneering status is its insistence that Scrooge cannot be opened to the claims of human compassion until he has learned to pity himself as the unhappy child he once was. And this is one of the ways in which Dickens demonstrates his formation within a Wordsworthian tradition, with its resonant claim that the child is father to the man. Dickens was one of the first to translate this psychological insight into fiction. The Ghost of Christmas Past enables Scrooge to see himself as a forlorn schoolboy left behind after his fellow pupils had been taken home for Christmas. And this vision is a turning point for Scrooge. I quote, "They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer still by the lines of plain deal forms and desks. At one of these, a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a form and wept to see his poor, forgotten self as he had used to be. Not a latent echo in the house, not a squeak and scuffle from the mice behind the panelling, not a drip from the half-thawed waterspout in the dull yard behind, not a sigh among the leafless boughs of one despondent poplar, not the idle swinging of an empty storehouse door, no, not a clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with softening influence and gave a freer passage to his tears." This transformative moment, reinforced as it is by that accumulated detail that marks the lavish language of this open-handed story, is connected with Dickens's own remembered life. Like Scrooge, Dickens felt that he too had been left to neglect and loneliness as a boy, and he was haunted by the memory of having been sent to work in a blacking factory at the age of 12. Years of popular acclaim in which he had established himself as the head of his own family had not healed this wound, which could only be addressed through the process of acknowledgement that finally brings about healing and growth. That personal reference deepens the emotional intensity that characterizes A Christmas Carol. But the book is not entirely about Scrooge, nor is it all about Dickens coming to terms with the traumas of his childhood. It's also a fierce polemic on wealth and poverty and on shared moral responsibility. Scrooge prides himself on being a man of business, and his business is finance. This, it turns out, is not his proper business. When Scrooge compliments Marley's ghost on his former business success, the ghost's response is bitter. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. This is the lesson that Scrooge has to learn. For at this point in his career, Dickens believed that charity of the kind that Scrooge practices at the end of the story was the best cure for the twin ills of ignorance and want, those pitiful and threatening children of misfortune that Scrooge encounters during his time with the ghost of Christmas Present. And there they are in John Leach's illustration. Later, he was to change his mind about the effectiveness of charity, but that's another story. A Christmas Carol was published in 1843 at a time of widespread hardship and a widening gap between rich and poor. It was also a time of political unrest, both in Europe and the UK. The Hungry Forties, as they came to be known, fermented thoughts of revolution and new models for the exercise of power and the distribution of wealth. Such thinking does not enter the potential remedies for suffering suggested by A Christmas Carol. Here, Dickens's underlying argument is that a greater degree of social cohesion, grounded in family loyalty, honesty, and a more equitable distribution of the proceeds of Britain's growing prosperity would counteract the economic strains that were pulling the nation apart. And the festival of Christmas could be a means of achieving that end. It is sometimes claimed, and you will no doubt have heard this claim, that Dickens more or less single-handedly invented Christmas as we know it. This is not true. Others had a hand in the move to reimagine Christmas, though Dickens did play a significant part. At the beginning of the 19th century, Christmas had seemed to be losing its importance. Traditionalists were mourning the supposed death of the old festival, all its ancient customs disregarded. The revival of Christmas in the middle years of the period had complex motives, and it was partly associated with a move to construct a specifically English national identity. But it also had much to do with the promotion of retail opportunities. Christmas represented a chance to sell goods of various kinds to those who found themselves with spare cash, food, drink, toys for the children, new clothes for parties and dances, presents for friends and family. The commercialization of Christmas, still a common cause for lamentation, is not a new thing. The version of Christmas that we find in Dickens and his contemporaries involves hot punch, the singing of carols, a great deal of feasting, and more emphasis on the exchange of gifts than had formerly been the case. And there was a new insistence that Christmas must be a time for families, coming together round a blazing hearth, differences forgotten. Families would be the front line of defense against the forces of social disintegration and those revolutionary influences emerging from the continent. The veneration of the royal family was part of this trend. So here we have an image from the Illustrated London News, a celebrated image, in fact, from 1848. Queen Victoria and her family gathered around the kind of decorated Christmas tree that the German Prince Albert had made very fashionable. It's a custom that was prominent in Germany and that Albert had promoted. He didn't altogether introduce it, but he certainly promoted him. And this image demonstrates the reach of the ideology of the family. It's so firmly embedded now into our understanding of Christmas that we hardly recognize it wasn't always there. But we'll all remember, I'm sure, the national woe, the outcry when lockdown meant that families couldn't get together at Christmas. People found that idea really almost intolerable. The warmth of the impoverished Cratchit's family life is what makes their poverty endurable. And Scrooge's reconciliation with his estranged family is key to the concluding harmony of A Christmas Carol. But the book is also bound up with that newly discovered value of Christmas for models of national commerce. A Christmas Carol is, as Dickens was in 1843, preoccupied with money and what money can and can't buy, in terms of Scrooge's hard-bitten financial dealings and also in the context of charity. And you'll all remember, I'm assuming you will all know the story of Christmas Carol, that the first thing that the reformed Scrooge does when he wakes on Christmas morning is to spend money buying that giant turkey for the Cratchits' Christmas dinner. And the story is full of images of profusion and especially of abundant food for those that can afford it. So the ghost of Christmas present is surrounded, you'll remember, with produce heaped up to form a kind of throne. Again, the profusion of detail that Dickens provides as part of what the story is doing here. Turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12 cakes, and seething bowls of punch. So, like the piles of game that you can see, they're a bit shadowy, but you can make them out, I'm sure, that form a border for this royal Christmas tree. It is an unapologetic apotheosis of excess consumption. So A Christmas Carol was not just written to make money, but that was its first purpose. and in this respect, it was a failure. Dickens published it at his own expense, hoping that he would earn more from taking a percentage of the profit than from the usual lump sum payment. But he was very fussy about this book and insisted on the highest standards of production. It was to be beautifully bound in red cloth. The red has faded over the years, but all contemporary accounts of the surviving first editions, that is, but all contemporary accounts agree it was a really lovely, really beautiful, glowing red cover, which Dickens had insisted on. The binding was to be, really special. It had gilt-edged pages. It had 4 hand-coloured etchings by John Leach. You've seen an example of that. And 4 additional black and white gravings. It was designed very specifically to be a desirable Christmas gift. And Dickens kept changing his mind, well, fatally, really, as to exactly how the whole thing was going to work, about the colour of the end papers, about this, about that, the other. So in the end, there was not really very much profit left in his book. And though it sold formidably well, he was only charging 5 shillings, and it wasn't quite enough for the associated expense of producing the book. The margin of profit was tiny, and quite a lot of that, in fact, most of it went on the legal fees that Dickens had to provide to try to counter the really shameless plagiarism that very quickly followed the publication of A Christmas Carol. So he didn't actually make any money out of the very first edition. He did on subsequent editions, I should say. But in terms of its reception, A Christmas Carol was from the first a huge success. Critics universally praised it, almost universally. There were 1 or 2 dissenting voices, aren't there, always, but almost universally praised it, many noting that it was likely to bring about social good. It was a national benefit, as William Thackeray put it, and readers loved it. They loved it from the first. It was published on December the 19th, 1843, quite close to Christmas. It had sold 6,000 copies by Christmas Eve, and that was a lot for 1843, and it never stopped selling. Indeed, it has never stopped selling, and it has never been out of print. It was adapted for the stage with lightning speed. By the end of February 1844, less than 3 months after the book's publication, there were 8 different unauthorized productions of A Christmas Carol on stage in London. 8. Theatre historians have lost count, as they frankly confess, of the number of subsequent stage adaptations, but they reckon there are around 400. Dickens himself later adapted his text for one-man performances, hugely popular, and from 1853 to 1870, he gave 127 of these readers, always to sell out audiences. There are, and you will hardly believe this, but I have verified this fact, 135 films based on A Christmas Carol, including, I think, the really wonderful Muppets version. I think it's very good, actually. There are 4 operas based on A Christmas Carol, 2 ballet versions, video games, actually. Last year there was a Broadway version, and so on. It's everywhere. A Christmas Carol is ubiquitous. So the popularity of A Christmas Carol began early, but it has proved to be very enduring. So if the London theatres were quick to notice the exceptional appeal of the book, so too were London publishers. Plagiarised versions, which were very bothersome to Dickens and also very expensive, started to appear almost immediately, some just reproducing Dickens stories, just changing the names, some introduced minor variations, and writers very soon began to produce Christmas books of their own. Punch noted in 1846 that, I quote, "The literature of England promises, or rather threatens, to be inundated this year with a flood of Christmas books. Every little author is preparing a 5-shilling volume in imitation of A Christmas Carol." It wasn't just the little authors who were writing Christmas books. The authors we now identify with mid-Victorian fiction at the height of its energy were also contributing. William Thackeray, Mary Braddon, Elizabeth Gaskell, Anthony Trollope, among many others. Some of those authors were eager to jump on a lucrative bandwagon, but others felt they had no choice because their publishers insisted that they wrote something for this profitable seasonal market. Anthony Trollope was a reluctant participant in what became a popular annual ritual. He wrote about the fashion for Christmas books in his autobiography, published posthumously in 1883. I quote, "Nothing can be more distasteful to me than to have to give a relish of Christmas to what I write. I feel the humbug," that Dickensian word, implied by the nature of the order. A Christmas story, in the proper sense, should be the ebullition of some mind anxious to instill others with a desire for Christmas religious thought or Christmas festivities, or better still, Christmas charity. They should, in other words, be like Dickens A Christmas Carol, and that wasn't the kind of book that Trollope wrote. Despite this reluctance, Trollope published 8 Christmas stories, prompted by market demand, very varied in tone and theme. Some, interestingly, actually, are like A Widow's Mite is an example, following Dickens's basic model. A Widow's Mite was published in the high-minded journal Good Words in 1863, and it follows Dickens in providing an example of charitable benevolence. Here, Trollope tells the story of a young woman due to marry a very rich American who gives the money that was to provide her trousseau so that she can help to relieve the sufferings of destitute weavers in the cotton famine brought about by the American Civil War. And like most of Trollope's short fiction, this Christmas story has an international flavour. It's a transatlantic story, in fact. But Trollope keeps a very cool distance from any inclination to employ Christmas as a means of reinforcing current notions of Englishness. Harry Heathcote of Gangoil, first published for the American market, actually, in 1873, is a short Christmas novel set in Australia, another country that Trollope knew at first hand, just as he knew America at first hand. And again, you can see that it's beautifully produced. It's got that gold lettering. A lot of Christmas books have that red binding, and you can see why it has a kind of seasonal flavour. And here, the annual arrival of Christmas provides a narrative framework for the story. You know, here's a Christmas, things happen, another Christmas, things happen, but little else. Though it ends with the reconciliation of enemies, there's no specific reference to the season's significance. The strongest of Trollope's Christmas stories, Catherine Carmichael, appeared in the Christmas number of the Masonic magazine, 1878. It's set among the gold miners and sheep farmers of New Zealand, another country that Trollope had visited. He was an inveterate traveller. Though, again, the tale is punctuated by 3 succeeding Christmases, it is, in fact, unremittingly bleak, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with the festive associations of the season. And here, Trollope's story is actually rather characteristic of the Christmas books that succeeded A Christmas Carol. They rarely meditate on the meaning of Christmas. Trollope, like many of his contemporaries, did not choose to follow in Dickens's footsteps in his very different Christmas books. Others were more directly influenced. Elizabeth Gaskell had a close working relationship with Dickens, whose support had helped to launch her career in its early years. They weren't always on the easiest terms with each other, largely because the sturdy Elizabeth Gaskell was inclined to resist Dickens's attempts to exert editorial control. But Gaskell was much more sympathetic than Trollope to Dickens' ambition to use Christmas books to exert a wholesome moral influence over their readers. But like Trollope, Elizabeth Gaskell struggled with the form. In 1850, excuse me, she agreed to write a Christmas story for Edward Chapman, who had published Mary Barton, her first novel, in 1848. She wrote to Lady Kay Shuttleworth, I quote, "Mr. Chapman asked me to write a Christmas story, recommending benevolence, charity, etc. To which I agreed. Why? I cannot think now, for it was very foolish indeed. However, I could not write about virtues to order, so it is simply a little country love story called Rosemary." This is the story that later became The Moorland Cottage, a short novel published by Chapman and Hall in 1850 as a Christmas book. Despite Gaskell's protestations, the tale is in fact deeply bound up with the exercise of Christian duty, telling the story of a somewhat implausibly blameless young woman who renounces the love of her life in a heroic attempt to redeem her degraded brother, who is as villainous as she is virtuous. The title page of the first edition, which you see before you, it's not very well produced, I hope you make out something of the image, was completely and utterly misleading. It provides a picture, as you see, of a happy and harmonious family, complete with cat, gathered around a cheerful fire. No such gathering, nor anything remotely like it, occurs in this somewhat grim book, which deals with painful betrayals, shipwreck, loss, and death. So, like Dickens, Gaskell is thinking about personal trauma in The Moorland Cottage, though in a very different way. Turns on difficult family relations, as much of her fiction does, and it thinks back to the distressing loss of her brother, who mysteriously disappeared on a voyage to India, never to be heard from again. And this story is, as much of Gaskell's fiction is, actually haunted by that piercing memory. Unlike Dickens, Gaskell does not use Christmas as a means of reinforcing the wider significance of her story. She really doesn't use Christmas at all. Nevertheless, despite her reluctance, she continued to contribute to the Christmas market. There's one exception to what I've been saying about Gaskell. There's one high-spirited story called Christmas Storms and Sunshine, which does employ Christmas to make its point, but on the whole, she will not do that. The most memorable of her contributions to the genre is the ghostly tale called The Old Nurse's Story, published in the Christmas number of Dickens's Household Words in 1852. And its concluding words are very directly in contradiction to the sentiments of A Christmas Carol, where the central character laments, "What is done in youth can never be undone in age." There are no second chances in The Old Nurse's Story. If you are looking for something other than A Christmas Carol to read as an example of Victorian Christmas books, I do recommend The Old Nurse's story. It's a real cracker, I can tell you, if you like a ghost story, as I do. So Dickens went on publishing Christmas books throughout the Hungry 40s. Chimes appeared in 1844, Cricket on the Hearth, 1845, The Battle of Life, 1846, The Haunted Man, 1848. And those books are really all a version of A Christmas Carol. They have plots that involve conditions of cold alienation restored to sympathy and compassion through the exercise of memory, together with a plea for the wealthy to address the needs of the poor. With the exception of The Battle of Life, which makes little reference to Christmas and has no ghosts, they all involve a dash of the supernatural. They were very widely read, and Dickens was at first fervently committed to this continuing project, feeling that its popularity might exercise real influence for good. He describes reading the manuscript of the Chimes to the actor William Macready. If you had seen Macready last night undisguisedly sobbing and crying on the sofa as I read, you would have felt as I felt. What a thing it is to have power. As one reviewer noted, Christmas was Christmas many centuries before Charles Dickens began to celebrate him in carols and chimes, but as it is, a Christmas book from him is as regular as a Christmas goose, and the one is not more certain of being devoured than the other is of being read extensively and with strong relish. But no one felt that those tales touched the unforgettable achievement of A Christmas Carol. And after 1848, Dickens felt that the demands of other projects meant he couldn't go on producing an annual Christmas book. What he tried to do instead was to produce a series of framed narratives in Christmas numbers of his journal Household Words, later its successor, All the Year Round, to which a group of writers would contribute loosely connected stories around a central theme. He eventually lost faith in that new strategy, having, he believed, failed to instill the shared purpose of Christmas stories in his stable of writers. Uneven in quality, these Christmas numbers nevertheless found a wide readership and helped to entrench the tradition of the Christmas book within national cultures. But many of these stories departed entirely from the model of A Christmas Carol. The 1859 portmanteau Christmas number of All Year Round had assembled a really stellar list of contributors. You won't be able to read that, but it'll give you an idea of how it is presented. They include Wilkie Collins, Sarah Smith, George Augustus Sala, Elizabeth Gaskell, Adelaide Proctor, the best of the writers of the period. The overall theme was the haunted house. So the different writers each wrote a story about a room, supposedly, in this haunted house. Elizabeth Gaskell's contribution was The Ghost in the Garden Room, published separately as The Crooked Branch. It is a devastating story, I think, very powerful story of treachery and vice. It is still more cheerless than The Moorland Cottage. Gaskell provides no pretense of any reference to the festival of Christmas, still less to any redemptive Christmas spirit. The best hope she has to offer is that all suffering and injustice is alleviated by death. The broken-hearted go home to be comforted of God. And here too, Gaskell defies the message of A Christmas Carol. The Ghost in the Garden Room is a strong contender for the title of the least Christmassy of all Victorian Christmas books, though there is plenty of competition. No wonder Dickens became discouraged with this format for the publication of Christmas stories. So I want to end this talk where I began, with A Christmas Carol. Why has it become the most enduringly successful of all Victorian Christmas books? What made it different? I've touched on some of the reasons for its popularity, but I haven't done full justice to its brilliance. One of the central reasons for its appeal is its movement from death to joyful revival. The story's ambivalent opening is partly comic in tone, but it insists on death as the story's starting point. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner, Scrooge, signed it. And Scrooge's name was good on change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. So you take my point, it's half comic, but it does insist on death as the starting point. Christmas comes at the coldest and darkest point of the natural cycle, when life is at its lowest ebb, the year's deep midnight, as John Donne puts it in his Nocturnal upon St. Lucy's Day, when the world's whole sap is sunk. And that's reflected in the season's very traditional preoccupation with death, with the dead, with their return as memories or as ghosts. Here's Scrooge in the graveyard looking at his own tombstone. Mamilius, the doomed child in Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale, reminds the audience that a sad tale's best for winter. Christmas had traditionally been a time when ghost stories were told round the fire, evoking demonic presences, ghostly visitors from the past. A Christmas Carol balances its urgent political message and its personal significance with older narrative rhythms. For Dickens, the meaning of the season is inextricably bound up with the haunting power of memory when vanished friends and family are assimilated into our festivities. In his tender essay on what Christmas is as we grow older, many of us in this room, looking around the room, will understand what he is writing about. He dwells on this point. Lost friend, lost child, lost parent, sister, brother, husband, wife. You shall hold your cherished places in our Christmas hearts and by our Christmas fires. But Christmas also celebrates the winter solstice, the pivot of the year. The dead return, but they are followed by the restoration of the light and of longer days. And of course, in the Christian calendar, this renewal of hope is marked by the birth of the Christ child. The conclusion of the story is a tour de force in which the reader is drawn into the story's persistent preoccupation with death, Scrooge's coming death, and the death of Tiny Tim, both unflinchingly described, and then into a rapturous experience of resurrection. Here's Scrooge with Cratchit. So in short, Dickens's story has it both ways. It moves from mourning to celebration, and it creates a perfect narrative arc in the process. Tiny Tim did not die, Dickens tells us, and neither does Scrooge. The account of Scrooge's waking on Christmas morning does something very unusual, not only in Victorian fiction, but in fiction more generally. It describes joy, not just contentment or resignation or even happiness, emotions that are far more common in narrative endpoints, but an active condition of joy, which allows for Scrooge's rebirth. I don't know what day of the month it is, said Scrooge. I don't know how long I have been among the spirits. I don't know anything. I'm quite a baby. Never mind. I don't care. I'd rather be a baby. This exuberant rebirth stays with the reader, and it is central to the book's persistence in our annual reenactments of Christmas. The appeal of its imaginative generosity shows no sign of fading, answers a shared need, and it does so with extraordinary skill. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dinah. We have time for questions, both in the room and online. If there are any questions online, please, I can see the chat in front of me on the computer here. So if you have any questions online, please enter them in the chat and I will read them out. I am now going to dash around the room with this microphone, should there be questions for our speaker. So hands up. Okay, we've got one in the middle. This is gets us started. So apologies, obstacle course here.
It's a very quick question, actually. It's just, can you tell me the name of the Elizabeth Gaskell cracking story? Because I didn't have a chance to take it on board.
That is the Old Nurse's story. You can read it online. You don't have to buy it on online text. And it is, I think, a very good Victorian ghost story.
Thank you.
One question at the back, I'll come to the one at the front. Okay, this is going to be a little interesting.
It's good to see Ian earning his living in this way, isn't
it? You mentioned that Dickens changed his view on charity later on. Could you comment a little bit about that?
Yes, I can. In his early writing, and you see this in Oliver Twist, you see it in Pickwick Papers, you certainly see it in Nicholas Nickleby, he believed that, as it were, the benevolence of individuals, exemplified in Scrooge, would be, as it were, the first defense against the social disintegration, the poverty, the suffering. Later, he became disillusioned. He began to feel, as he experienced failed attempts based on those charitable endeavours to address the scale of the need in London and indeed elsewhere in the industrial cities that were springing up and growing so quickly in the industrial north. So he felt, as he aged, perhaps became not only more experienced, but more cynical, that it just wasn't enough, that there was a need for a more structural approach to at least, I was going to say solving, but he came to feel that really there was no easy way of solving these problems, but at least of addressing the problems, that it was never going to be fixed by simple goodwill and charitable giving by those who could afford it. It's not that he didn't feel that that remained our responsibility, but he just felt it wasn't enough. So he became committed to national schemes of philanthropy and reorganization, as for instance, better networks of schools supported by some national funding. I mean, he died too soon to see that start to come to pass, that would begin to make a real difference to the poverty. So he just felt charity wasn't going to do it, wasn't going to cut it in the end. But that was you see that in the later novels. Yeah.
Okay, we've got one question in the audience, and I'm going to go and check the chat. So.
Could you tell me if it's been published in many foreign languages, and was it successful in non-English speaking?
It was very successful in many different languages. It has been endlessly translated and was, pretty quickly after its publication in England, pirated abroad. It was very successful in the States. And it was particularly successful in France. Actually, they really liked it in France, and there were translations there. And also, perhaps slightly more unexpectedly, in Russia. They were very enthusiastic about A Christmas Carol in Russia. Dickens was very widely read in Russia. Tolstoy, for instance, was extremely enthusiastic about Dickens in general, read a lot of Dickens actually, but particularly about Christmas Carol, which he thought was a really important book. So yes, the answer to your question is that it was indeed read very widely in English-speaking countries, like Australia, New Zealand, States, Canada, but also, yes, there were translations. They emerged pretty quickly. And indeed, its popularity persisted in those countries for many years. And even now, it's not forgotten. So yes, it was an international impact.
Online, there are no questions online at the moment, just very positive praise, but I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question myself, which is about, you spoke about Trollope and Gaskell both in some ways deliberately, or at least knowingly, pushing against the expectations. I mean, yeah. I think what was the Gaskell saying, recommending benevolence, charity, etc. That etc. And so disdainful. Do you get a sense that the readers responded negatively to that, or is it just a case that there was just so much demand for these Christmas stories that the fact that some were not Christmassy didn't really make a difference to their popularity?
It's a very good question, Ian, and it's hard to give a conclusive answer because we don't, as you know, always know very clearly how readers did respond. I mean, I think it would often depend on the quality of the writing, but I do think that as the years went by, and of course we're talking about rather later examples, particularly with the Trollope, there was a turning away from the sweetness, if you like, represented in the tone of A Christmas Carol, which didn't diminish the popularity of A Christmas Carol itself. That had a peculiar place, I think, and still does have a peculiar place in the nation's imaginative life. But in general, there was a move away from that tone, that way of thinking about Christmas among many, not all, but among many writers. Whether it really damaged the success of those stories, as I said, it's hard to say, but we do know that those stories never touched the level of popularity of A Christmas Carol. And frankly, you can see why. I mean, if you read The Moorland Cottage, or I've just been recommending The Old Nurse's Story, they are very good. And Harry Heathcote's a fascinating, a really interesting account of mid-19th century life in Australia, in rural Australia. And I do think Catherine Carmichael that bleak story. You know, it packs a terrific punch. These are high quality pieces of fiction, but you can see why Catherine Carmichael was not going to carry quite the currency as Scrooge. I mean, it will cast a real dampener over the annual festivities. That story, I can tell you. You know, we do need, do we not, in some circumstances, fiction that will give us something other than bleakness. And I think, you know, the difference, if you like, between those stories, and again, something I didn't really talk about, but perhaps should, and what Dickens offers in A Christmas Carol and in his other Christmas books, perhaps less successfully, but they're not, you know, they're not without their own power. The concept of the second chance, which I do think is really important to the enduring success of A Christmas Carol, that no matter how badly we've behaved, no matter how diminished we may have become because of our behavior, because of the way we've fenced ourselves in to certain sorts of patterns, certain codes of value, there is room for a second chance. And that really is very often, I'm afraid, what particularly Gaskell, but also Trollope and some other writers were pushing against. Gaskell particularly, though there are characters in her fiction that do have second chances, but broadly speaking, she is suspicious of that notion of the conversion, if you like, which you find elsewhere in Dickens. Dickens, particularly in the early fiction, was very committed to that. I mean, you see it elsewhere in novels like Dombey and Son, you know, and the conversion of Mr. Dombey and others. But Gaskell wouldn't quite have that. And I think, though I won't say that made her unpopular, it did mean that there wasn't that sense of an immediate appeal that I think A Christmas Carol still has for us, that there might still be time for a different life.
Question over there, and then we'll come to the front. So, Dipali, did you have a question? Oh, did you? Oh.
I did. Well, I was just wondering, do you feel that the commercial world has a lot to thank Dickens, because with this novel, he actually created a festival all over the world, because Christmas is celebrated everywhere. I mean, not just in the Christian world, but everywhere.
Yeah.
And obviously, it's a huge time for commercial gain as well. So I was wondering whether that is something that's been chronicled and, you know, recognized in the commercial world.
It's a very good question. I mean, I don't think it was just Dickens. I think that there was, in the mid-19th century, a move to exploit what were identified as the commercial opportunities of this festival. So whether we think that's something to celebrate or condemn, I don't think it's entirely at Dickens' door. But I do think Dickens had a part to play. And I do remember once speaking to a very hard-headed businessman about the value, as I often do, of the humanities and of literature. And he said, "You will not be able to give me a single example," said he, "of how literature has made a difference to the British economy." And I was able, with some pride, to come back like a shot and say the turkey industry.
Exactly.
Because it was Dickens, in that particular respect, that made turkey indispensable to our celebration of Christmas. You remember how the Cratchits have got this dismal goose? Well, I don't know if anyone in this room has prepared goose for a Christmas dinner. I have in my time done this in a spirit of traditional reverence. Well, it's most disappointing, because what happens is, let me tell you, if you haven't done it, you end up with this great lake of fat, which runs out of the goose, and you don't know what to do with it. And then you've got this withered little bird in the middle, which nobody really wants. But a turkey is a really successful roasting bird, and very economically successful because they have a very good conversion rate. You know, they convert food to flesh at a high old rate. But, you know, because of that giant turkey and the kind of spirit of abundance and generosity and happiness that it represents, so much better than that too small turkey, everyone wants to buy into that. And even now, somehow, for most of us, Christmas isn't quite Christmas, is it, if there's no turkey involved somewhere along the line? And that is Dickens. That did come from A Christmas Carol. So it was a great moment of triumph for me. Turkey industry in Norfolk.
Talking about turkeys, America is the place, there's a place in America where most of the turkeys come from. So they would be very, very grateful to Dickens.
They should be. I'm sure they are.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a question here and then there's one online.
Hello, you mentioned that there were operas based on A Christmas Carol. Can you tell me what they are and who the composers are?
I can't.
No.
That's soon answered. But I know they exist. Nor do I know if they're any good. But you can see there might be. I mean, I do think it's a good framework for an opera. Yes, I would also, really, I should be ashamed of myself. But the truth is, I can't answer your question because I don't know. But I know there are 4 of them. Nor have I ever, since I'm confessing, attended either of the 2 ballets. But again, you know, you can see it might work. But I do think The Muppets is very good.
So a question online from Stuart Reynolds, who is our Christmas lecture convener, who points out that the religious content of Christmas is barely mentioned in the story, and there's no mention, as he says, of the spiritual redemption of the kind traditionally offered by the church. Was Dickens or the story or the novel criticised for this at the time?
No, by and large, it wasn't. And that's a very interesting question, I think. For this reason, it does seem to me that the story is imbued with Dickens's own Christian convictions. And we do know that he had such convictions, and we know that they were often on his mind. He wrote about the Christian faith for his children, in his Life of Christ. So it's not that this story is emerging from an irreligious temperament, but Dickens's temperament, though I think was religious in the broadest sense, was not in any sense theological. And he was dismayed in the middle years of the 19th century, certainly at the time he was writing Christmas Carol, by the religious dissent, as it were, and controversies and ill feeling and debates and quarrels, which he thought very destructive among the Christian community. He was not, broadly speaking, in favor of the evangelical Christian positions, nor broadly speaking with nonconformism. You remember, for instance, those of you who looked at his letters or journals at all, how passionately he was opposed to the notion that Sunday must be kept very solemn and that there must be no pleasure or enjoyment on Sunday, which he thought was a cruel edict. So there were ways in which he separated himself from Christian doctrines and certainly from religious disputes. So I think what he was doing in A Christmas Carol was writing in what he defined as a Christmas spirit of rebirth, of that second chance, forgiveness, redemption, charity, benevolence, but with a theological content kind of abstracted. But Scrooge does go to church, if you remember, on that Christmas morning, and that's important that happens. That is part of his recovery and revival. And I think the broad outline of the story is, in my view, is Christmas. You know, the reference to the baby at the end, and of course, as we know, Christmas is finally the celebration of a baby and the birth of a baby. I think that's not an accident. I think that Dickens did expect his readers to have that sense. So I think that's the fact that it doesn't refer specifically to a spiritual redemption, that there isn't that spiritual dimension to the story, was something that was part of what Dickens had chosen to do in A Christmas Carol.
Question?
Actually, Stuart asked my question, so I'll ask another one. So if Dickens was to write The Christmas Carol today, what differences, if any, would there be, do you think?
'Tis an impossible question. Because we can't know, can we? Dickens would have been a different figure. But I do think, having said that, what we can legitimately suppose, or at least speculate, is that he would have continued the central theme of A Christmas Carol. Perhaps it was in your mind as I was speaking. Those divisions between rich and poor, they haven't disappeared, have they? The need for charity. Okay, maybe Dickens, the later Dickens was right. Charity is not going to be enough. You know, food banks, I mentioned briefly food banks, they're not going to solve the problem, are they? But that doesn't mean we shouldn't contribute to food banks or to charity. Or, and here perhaps I speak for myself, it is a good time of year, isn't it? After all, despite all the exasperations of Christmas, which we have all experienced, no doubt, it is a good time of year to set aside, you know, quarrels and disputes, and to try to be positive about difficult members of the family. And, to do our best to follow the example of Scrooge's conversion. And I think, you know, there's a lot of anger in A Christmas Carol, of course. Ignorance and want. Ignorance and want have not, alas, disappeared. They are still with us. Dickens would still have been angry. So I don't know what a new Christmas Carol would look like. Of course, plenty have speculated. You know, those 400 stage adaptations, some of the films are indeed doing just that, trying to put themselves into Dickens's Victorian boots and writing a contemporary Christmas Carol. It always makes me uncomfortable, actually, because, you know, there's a kind of cultural arrogance in supposing we can do that, really. But there are some themes, preoccupations of Christmas Carol that are still with us. And perhaps the book still does have that power to move. Many people read it every Christmas, read it aloud. It's quite a common, you know, I've been doing a little bit of work, as you gather, on Christmas Carol and talking about it to people. I've been surprised by how many people say, oh, I read that to the family every Christmas. It's still there. So people do still feel that power in Dickens's text within their contemporary life. And perhaps that's the way to think of it.
There was one more question. Yes, just microphone coming to you from the right. There you go.
I've really enjoyed this evening. Thanks very much. Just a footnote. Before coming out, I had in the back of my mind that Jerome K. Jerome had written some ghost stories specifically for Christmas. And I pulled them down, Tales After Supper, published 1890. The cover, because it's a first edition, is bright red.
Mm-hmm.
The lettering is lavish, gold. The illustrations, there are over 90 of them in this book, is carrying on that commercial tradition. I don't think it has the same purposes, maybe, as Christmas Carol. It has a purpose of making people happy at Christmas time. And have you come across, in the next 50 years after Dickens, a great tradition of this sort of publication, merely really Christmas decorations to give us joy.
You're absolutely right. It was a lingering tradition in terms of book production, and they are often, not always, often the bindings were green actually, but the red binding was surprisingly lingering as a tradition. They were often those 19th century books, and they continue right up to the First World War, actually. They're often beautifully produced. They had illustrations, as you say. They had high quality bindings, and they were designed to be Christmas presents. There's no doubt about it. Published for the Christmas market at, by and large, what was intended to be at an affordable price level. So though the contents, I haven't read those particular stories, may have moved very far from Dickens's intention, the overall drive, the commercial thrust of the Christmas book market was indeed a long-lasting one. And it then, of course, there was the Christmas annual, you know, which went right through the 20th century and indeed beyond. And it is still the case that publishers tend to align their year with the Christmas market. That it's still a hugely important milestone for publishers' years. They don't publish Christmas books in quite that way, but they certainly do produce books that they hope will be purchased in that kind of spirit for the Christmas market. So in that sense, very simple point, really, you know, it does persist. But that Dickensian tradition of the book that is specifically Christmassy in the way it's put together, I think you're right. I think that went on long after Dickens had died and that tradition had disappeared. So I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you so much, Dinah. That was an enthralling, informative, and wide-ranging talk, which has given us many things to think about, not least on your final comments there about there are now 10 shopping days left to Christmas. So I'd like us all to give a round of applause to our lecturer. And just as I thank you for coming out tonight, I'd like to beg your indulgence in labouring something of a Dickensian parallel with where the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution finds itself by invoking the spirits of the BRLSI past, present, and future. And one of the things that you didn't mention, you were careful about this. 1824 for Charles Dickens was not a year to remember, because that was the year in which his father was imprisoned for debt, and he went as a 12-year-old boy to work in a blacking warehouse. But for us here in Bath, 1824 was a red letter year in the institution, then the Bath Literary and Scientific Institution was founded with a public commitment to promote science, literature, and the arts. And we may not be in the same purpose-built building that opened in 1825, but we, the spirit of BRLSI present, remain a many splendid thing: museum, library, exhibition space, forum for public talks, a venue for local groups to meet, and a social space. But it is the spirit of BRLSI yet to come that is most exciting. And in just over a month, we will launch our bicentenary year with 12 months of talks, festivals, exhibitions, family events, and other activities. And beyond that, a vision to become once again the city's premier cultural hub, a place where Bath's thinkers, makers, and doers of all ages and backgrounds can come together to meet, to learn, and to imagine. And that indeed is something to celebrate. And on that note, Merry Christmas, everyone, and a happy bicentenary year.